morning and welcome to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My name is Chris Capizzola. I'm a professor in the history department here at MIT, and I'm also our senior associate dean for Open Learning, an organization of 175 staff members whose mission is to transform teaching and learning at MIT and around the globe through the innovative use of digital technologies. And on behalf of MIT Open Learning, the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing, and all of the faculty, staff, and students at the Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our campus. A word about that campus. MIT is in dialogue with indigenous nations that are the traditional stewards of this land, and acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, MIT has benefited from the dispossession of indigenous territories elsewhere. We reckon with that past in order to build a more inclusive future. Since 1861, MIT has been a site for innovation, including some of the technical advances that have brought generative AI technologies and tools to users around the world in the last few years. MIT is committed to addressing the global opportunities and challenges presented by the ubiquity of computing across industries and academic disciplines, and by the rise of artificial intelligence. The MIT Schwarzman College of Computing, where we gather today, is at the heart of this endeavor. In addition, whether from MIT licensed open software to the open access publications of MIT Press and the MIT libraries, to the 2,500 courses published on MIT OpenCourseWare, the Institute has also been an important voice committed to open education, publication, preservation, and dissemination. And we seek to bring those open values to the new world of AI as well. We thank the Axum Collaborative, as well as an exciting range of co-sponsors for convening us today. And to do that, I'm going to turn things over now to three of them to kick us off. First, Jim Runcie.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning and welcome. I want to thank you for joining us on day 2 of the AI convening. Yesterday was fantastic. I thought Bridget, John, and Dan really kicked us off, and then Bharat really created an environment for some dynamic conversation yesterday. So I took one thing away from the conversation with Bridget, John, and Dan. I am an 8-inch floppy drive club member, right? And I guess I was surprised to see so many folks in here to go back to that time. And actually, I don't know if any of you remember Interlisp D. Anyone remember Interlisp D? That was, okay, that's great. We got 2 members of the club right here. But it was an initial AI programming language that we used when I was in school. And it was pretty rudimentary, but we did some AI coding back then. And so I never really thought AI was going to be as big as it, did become over the last couple of years. I thought it was, again, Interlisp D version 2, but things have moved on. Anyway, I'm honored to co-host this event with Vistas and Stephanie. Looking forward to some great conversation around AI and how we can manage, the impact of AI across these institutions and to make sure that it supports students in the way that we all would want it to do. I founded Education Advancement in 2018, about 6 years ago, and a lot has happened in that time. We've worked with our partner institutions to meet some challenges. There was the COVID pandemic. There was the Better FAFSA crisis, SCOTUS decision. There are a bunch of things that disproportionately impacted our partner institutions and the students they serve. The concern now is, since ChatGPT about 2 years ago came out, we've had lots of conversations with our partner institutions and many organizations around the impact of AI. And I think it's really important that we focus on all the various stakeholders. So it's really wonderful that all the folks in this room are getting together, having great conversations about how we make sure that this benefits everyone in an equal way. And I think it's also important, and this was mentioned yesterday, that the voice of the students and the institutions, especially institutions that serve under-resourced, first-generation, low-income students, that they achieve the promise of AI, but they're also protecting some level of risk mitigation. So anyway, looking forward to the conversations today, and looking forward to advancing this concept of AI impacting, the schools that we serve.
Well, good morning, everyone, and first of all, thank you for those who've been organizing this. I know there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and thanks to all of you for caring enough to be here about this very important topic. So let me take you way back behind even the floppy drive, because I grew up with punch cards, for those of you who remember punch cards. So through history, society in higher ed has had sort of pivotal moments where technology gives us a chance to perhaps make a difference. Starting with the Gutenberg press, perhaps the computer, the web, and now perhaps AI, that provide the opportunity to bring talent and opportunity closer together, to use knowledge to open more doors to more people in the population, and to provide impact at levels not dreamt of before. So for Complete College America, what this means is greater access, more attainment, enabling learners everywhere to gain from socioeconomic mobility. Our focus is on ensuring that we bring the very best of perspective, practice, and policy all together. And right here this afternoon and through the day, we'll be talking a lot more about that. There are 4 questions that I'd like to leave you all with this morning. First, how do we ensure that this technology, a platform, a tool, is placed to best enhance, expand, and re-envision higher education, rather than just trying to solve the prosaic problems that either we were too lazy to solve or we did not have the fortitude to address in the past. 2, how do we use it to move away from our historic, pure assembly line approach to one that allows every learner to learn when they need to, how they need to, and what they need to. 3, how do we incorporate this technology to re-envision higher ed to provide opportunities at scale, moving across and away from the perceived or real scarcities in terms of learning, in terms of expertise, in terms of location? And 4th, how do we envision and ensure that we not only narrow, but totally obliterate the digital gap rather than expanding it through the use of AI? So I'm looking forward to a wonderful set of discussions, but I'd hope that those discussions are going to be ones that put the learner rather than the faculty and the institution at the center. That they're ones that focus on the more than 85% of our student population at the undergraduate level who don't go to the elites and the flagships, but go to regionals, go to community colleges. Ones that assure success for the more than 52% of our graduates who are underemployed 1 year after graduation. And discussions where we do not add another 1 million people every year to the 38+ million who have some college but no degree and therefore are not able to benefit from socioeconomic mobility. Great challenges, but great minds. And I'm hoping by the end of today, we will have a path forward that benefits not just the present, but the future for all students everywhere.
Thank you so much, Vistaf and Jim and Chris. We are just so delighted to co-host this. You can see the power of partnerships and collaborations when we can work together across institutions to be able to tackle the types of challenges, Jim, that you and Vistaf both raised. I, too, was inspired by yesterday's discussion when you think about where we are in this moment of time, where there's traumatic change going on in our higher education systems. There's increased skepticism of the value of education and the fact that 85% or millions of people each year are getting broad access education, but we're not serving them in ways that help them find new pathways to complete. That is a challenge of our time. challenge of our time is technology. When you have this level of technology disruption, it's a moment when you put those two together when we actually can do something significant. I think of these moments as unfrozen. We're in a moment where things are now unfreezing, and they don't happen very often. Some people think that's inflection points. Not to date myself, but I think you might beat me, Vistop. Over 30 years ago, I started working down the street on the same street, Vassar Street. I was green scraping off of 3090s, so I don't know if that's a little bit after punch cards, but not that far after punch cards. And we sat in rooms like this, and we could see the internet coming, and we worried about. We talked about community. We said, let's not commercialize this. And we knew it was a little kumbaya, but we thought it might be possible. And we also thought a little bit about access. But today, still 18 million people don't have access to the internet. It's over 30 years later. And so what can we learn of the questions we asked then, but maybe didn't find ways to stick with to make sure that access, and actually more than access, but outcomes result? So to me, the challenge of today is how can we learn from our discussions yesterday? How can we learn from how to ask good questions? I think Bharat asked a beautiful question that got us all thinking much more deeply. How do we bring those kinds of questions to today's conversation? This is not about panel discussions. This is about asking questions, going deeper, and having workshops to see and do what happens so we can then leave with the big questions, but also the practical realities. So I'm grateful to be here. I am thankful to all of you. And I can't give enough thanks for the teams, your teams, Jim and Vistop and Charles, who helped put this together with Complete College of America and Advancement with the support of Hewlett. I will let Philip take some more gratitude, but I can't thank you enough because it takes all of us to make something like this come together and to make it real. So thank you all. And I now have the honor of introducing our next speaker, Professor David Deming. So David comes to us from the Harvard Kennedy School, but he's doing his sabbatical here at MIT, so you get the best of bridging both of these worlds. David is highly committed to these issues. He has been working for decades on issues of economic mobility and thinking about what that means for skills and efforts like the Climb Initiative and thinking about higher education and how do we promote social economic mobility. Harvard Project on Workforce and thinking about what does it mean from the skills perspective and the employer perspective. And then the Skills Lab and thinking about what are the types of soft skills and durable skills that matter and last. And if you follow him, you'll see his Forked Lightning blogs that are really starting to think about what does this mean for the future. And so we are very delighted to welcome David. I know David also, one thing to know about him is he lives with undergrads. And so one of the things I'll say about thinking about how do you help hundreds of undergrads make progress to a degree, not just for their academic potential, but also their social and personal development takes a special kind of person, and just grateful for that. It's work that I've done in the past, and I can tell you, you start aging after you leave. So hold on to that. There's more aging to come, but it's the students at the center that I'll leave you with. So welcome to David, and thank you.
All right, well, hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks, Stephanie, for that very kind and somewhat harrowing introduction. As Stephanie mentioned, I am professor at the Kennedy School and also at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. That's where I started. And I am going to talk with you today about the possible labor market impacts of AI. Before I do that, I just want to say, you might say, well, this is a conference about AI and education. And even though I'm going to be talking about labor market impacts, you know, most of my career I've been working squarely on issues of education, and also this project, some of the early work from this project I'm going to talk to you about arises from the work that I started doing as soon as I stepped down from a leadership role at the Kennedy School. I was serving as the academic dean there for 3 years, and seeing how conversations about AI have changed the way we think about education at Harvard. And then also, as Stephanie mentioned, my wife and I are faculty deans at Kirkland House, so one of the Harvard undergraduate houses. So I live, you know, amongst the undergraduates, 400 of them or so. And one of the reasons that I started to work on this, and what some results I'll show you from a nationally representative survey of generative AI usage at home and at work that my colleagues and I conducted, was really born out of conversations I would have with, you know, friends of mine who are mostly, you know, middle-aged academics, aging maybe more rapidly, some of us than others. Most of those folks, to be honest, myself included a few months ago, had an instinctive skepticism about AI and tended to view it more as a curiosity. Oh yeah, I've used it a little bit, but I'm not really sure where it fits in, et cetera, and kind of skeptical about the AI hype cycle. And then when you talk to students, it's just clear that everybody's using it. The way I ask the question is not, do you use it? Because they tend to be a little skittish about it. I say, like, what share of your friends do you think are using it? It's like, 90%, 80%, 100%. So that really tells you where this is going and how rapidly it's changing. And that turns out to be something, we didn't find 100%, but we found much higher numbers than what, skeptical economists like me might have thought going in. So I came to this project thinking, well, how am I going to try to say something intelligent about the future labor market impacts of AI. I think it was Yogi Berra that said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And it's true, you look even just in the very recent past about predictions about AI even a decade ago, and predictions people would make by doing things like asking experts, when will AI be able to do the tasks humans can do, and projecting that onto jobs, and people get these huge numbers like, half of all jobs are going to be gone in a decade, and none of that turned out to be true. So I didn't want to contribute in that direction, but I also didn't want to be dismissive. So I thought, well, how should I reason about this problem? And I decided to reason exactly how large language models reason, which is from training data. Okay. And so what I decided to do is write this, I have a Substack called Forked Lightning, and Stephanie mentioned that, and I'm writing a series which is really just helping me think about it on my own, which is like, okay, how do I get into this issue? I really wanted to work on AI and technological change and how AI will affect labor markets, and I thought, well, there's no better way to do that than to study the past of technological disruption. So this is not the first transformative technology that has hit labor markets. There's actually a long and rich history of that. And I thought, well, let me try to build some training data, look at what's happened in the past, and try to generate some common themes and predictions about what might happen in the future. Okay, so that was my process, and I figured if I write it for people, the discipline of having to not appear like an idiot in front of several thousand people is useful in making sure that your thoughts are stress-tested and sensible. So that was my process. Okay, so this is the talk. So I want to start with the observation that we've been here before. Okay, so this is a figure from a paper that I recently published with Chris Ong and Larry Summers called Technological Disruption in the Labor Market. And what we did was go back to take census data and American Community Survey data back to 1880 and ask what has been the long run change in the US labor market in terms of the composition of jobs. Okay, and so these are pretty broad categories in part because, you can't look at computer jobs because there were no computer jobs prior to 1980, and so, the changes in occupation codes mean you have to be broad brush. So what we've done here is divided jobs into about 6 different categories, and computed the share of all jobs in the US economy in each year that were in those categories. So this doesn't account for the, obviously there's actually more farmers today than there were in 1880, but there's more people today than there were in 1880 in the US. And so think about this as if you were to just poll a random worker and ask them, what's your job? What is the probability it would be in one of these groups? And so what you see, and this is I think known to a lot of people, is huge, huge changes over the long run in the composition of the US labor market. So around the turn of the 20th century, 2 in 5, 40% of all jobs were in farming or agriculture. And it was mostly subsistence farming. It was farming to support your family, you and your immediate family. It was not even remunerative in a lot of ways. It was just staying alive, basically. So about 2 in 5 jobs were in farming, and now it's less than 2%. So about 1 in 50, okay? If you look at blue-collar jobs, this is manufacturing, production, construction, labor, installation, maintenance, repair, all those things. It's gone from 40% to something like 20%. And you've seen a huge rise in professional, managerial, and technical occupations. This is managers, business workers, software developers, things like that. Okay, and so I think there's 3 things you can take away from this. Okay, one is we have really been here before. And if you think about the breathless proclamations of widespread change that you've read about in the last 20 years, the way things are, the pace of change is moving faster than ever. If you just kind of look at this figure, I'll move over here a little bit. You can see in the last 20 years there's been some change, okay? But actually, maybe not as much as in the past, okay? And so things are changing rapidly, but disruption is a constant state of the labor market. Okay, it's always happening. If you think about mid-century, this is the time when we saw the most disruption in the labor market by some objective sense. What was happening? Well, farm work was being heavily mechanized. Okay, so instead of a farmer either producing enough food to feed their family, usually using horses and mules and livestock, it was converting that labor into a much more efficient form, which is the mechanized tractor powered by an internal combustion engine. Okay, and so what that allowed farmers to do was go from feeding their families to feeding hundreds of thousands of families, becoming much more efficient, increasing productivity by 200, 300, 400%. And And so that's the kind of change that we saw. We also saw in mid-century a move away from railroads and toward the personal automobile. So we had a whole railroad industry, tons of people working in the railroads. My grandfather worked on the railroads. And now very few people do that because we have a personal automobile. So huge changes within blue-collar occupations and move toward different forms of transportation away from railroads, changes in the industrialization of the US economy. So these things have all been going on for a long time. And we can look at things like the development of steam power, the development of electricity. These are fundamental technologies that transformed our society. And it could be true that AI is bigger than electricity, but electricity was pretty big, right? Pretty big. And so the second lesson from this is that these things take longer than you think. Okay? So the principle of magnetic energy generation was first discovered by Michael Faraday in 1832. In 1880, Thomas Edison patented the incandescent light bulb. So that was really the first commercially successful development of a technology that used electricity. So that's 50 years. Okay. So you might think, okay, but for 50 years, Edison built a big power plant, the Edison Power Company, in the middle of New York City in 1882, so 2 years after he patented the light bulb. You might think, well, that was the time when electricity really took over. No. By 1900, only 3% of US households were electrified. Only 8% of urban households were electrified. And 5% of total mechanical capacity in factories was electrified. So electricity was not, 2 decades after the invention of the light bulb, electricity was far from ubiquitous. It was actually rare. It wasn't until the late 1920s when we reached a benchmark you might think of as the economy being electrified, which is just half, a bit over half of total factory power was electrified by the 1920s. So depending on whether you account from invention or commercialization, that's either 100 years or 50 years. And it's not like nobody thought this was a big deal. Right? The light bulb was a big deal. Everyone knew that electricity was going to change everything. But it took longer than we thought. And the reason is that you have to really re-engineer everything in the economy to fully take advantage of a new technology. So if you think about what were the benefits of electricity, it has this feature that AI does, which is that it's general purpose, right? It can be used for a lot of different things. And you say, actually, I have this distributed power source. With steam power or mechanical power, you've got this big engine in the middle of a factory, and everything flows outward from that. Electricity is much more distributed, so you can reorganize the factory floor in a way that optimizes production. You can train people differently. You can also develop tons of personal household appliances, the dishwasher, the refrigerator, the oven, all possible much more because of electricity than because of steam or mechanical power. And those things just took time to diffuse. Right? So that's the second lesson, is that it takes a lot longer than we think. I think the third really important lesson from AI that's helpful is to think about what is the fundamental problem that the technology is solving. Okay, so in the case of farm work, the reason why I went from 40% to 2% was that the fundamental bottleneck for farm work was power, right? We went from person power, you get tired, plowing the field all day is hard work, and then you say, well, let's use horses and mules. They have more horsepower than we have horsepower, and so farmers use livestock to relieve the power constraint. And then the steam engine was developed, and you say, wow, we have this incredible mechanical power source, but we have all these technical problems to solve to make it so workable that we can get rid of our horses and our mules. And that's the process that took forever. But once we did that, once you had a small gas-powered tractor, the Ford Sun, actually the kind of tractor analog of the Model T Ford was the first mass-powered tractor. Once you have that, you don't need horses anymore. You don't need mules anymore. And then you've got this thing that will generate tons and tons of power, never get tired. You can fill up the gas engine very easily. And then we mechanized farm work. And then the reason why farmers went from 40% to 2% was because you only need so much food. So if you get 300 times more productive at making food, you might want a little more food than we had before when people were fighting for survival, but you don't need 300 times more food. And so the share of all economic activity devoted to agricultural production reduced because we got so productive. And so that lesson's very important for thinking about AI, because the question is, what is the problem that AI is solving? What are we getting from great AI technology that we don't have before? Anybody want to hazard a question, I guess? What are we doing with it? Efficiency in what? What is the purpose of retrieving data and manipulating data? So this is the question we have to think about. I'm going to give you what I think is an answer, but the question is, if we have an AI technology, an incredible transformative technology that can do white-collar office work more efficiently, what problem is that solving at the end of the day? What is it doing for us? Okay, and to think about that, we need to think a little bit about information, right? Because when you think about mechanizing farm labor or blue-collar work, it's a little bit easier to see that analogy. It's like we have this physical power constraint, and then I have this machine that can do it very cheaply and never gets tired, and the energy source is cheap enough that it's cheaper than a person, and I can replace the person. But what is the thing that we're doing in office work that needs to be replaced? What's the value of that work? So what is not exactly? But what is knowledge work? What is the purpose of knowledge work? So, right. So to answer that question, I want you to think about the telephone. Okay. This is a picture of a telephone switchboard in 1915. Why do we have this? Well, when the telephone was invented, more or less by Alexander Graham Bell, there's a bit of controversy about that, but let's say it was in 1870. AT&T quickly realized the value of it because we have a human need to communicate, right? And we, in 1870, in the early 1900s, were living in an information-starved environment. If you want, it's hard to think about a world where you can't pick up the phone and call somebody you know. You've got to send them a letter or something. And it's hard to think about a world where every office transaction needs to be recorded manually, right? Actually, by shorthand is the way people used to do it, right? So it's like people can speak faster than they can write, and people have bad memories, so we need some way to memorialize transactions. And that didn't exist. And the telephone said, wow, actually, we can communicate with each other in a much more efficient way, and then that also created more needs for us to transcribe the results of that communication for business, right? And so what did the telephone do? Well, it said, okay, I can call any person. But if you think about it, I might want to call every single person in this room at some point if I'm a business. So how many connections does that require? A lot, right? Because it's a connection between me and all of you and everybody else, et cetera. It's actually n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So in a city of 10,000 people, that's 50 million connection lines, right? That's way too big to do feasibly. And so what telephone companies did is they said, let's have a switchboard. So you call in and you say, I would like to talk to David Deming. Please patch me through. And then these people right here, these young women, mostly young women who were hired by AT&T and their subsidiary companies, would look for the patch cord that connects to David Deming. And when it was small, you could do it by name, but eventually they had to give numbers. That's why you have a telephone number. And they would find the little cord, they would plug in the person who was calling me and plug it into me and make the connection. Right? But if you think about that problem, that's human labor to solve the very kind of last mile of connecting two people. It gets harder and harder the denser the network, right? For this exact reason. A city of 10,000 people, 50 million connections. And so these jobs were super stressful. The turnover rate for a telephone operator in 1915 was 40% per year. And these women actually went on, some women in the New England area, telephone operators went on strike and shut down the New England telephone lines for 5 days because they were so tired of the brutal working conditions of running around. They used to wear roller skates and run around and plug things in, and it was crazy. And so what happened was AT&T and their partner companies said, well, the denser the networks and the more people want to communicate, and they did, the greater a chance we have, the greater value there is to automating this. So they invented this. Now, I am old enough to have used one of these. How many of you guys have used okay, good, most of you. Okay, the rotary phone. So when I was a kid, I loved using the rotary phone. My grandparents had one on their wall in the kitchen. And I used to just go and I would dial it just to dial it. And it's the pleasing, you press the click and you turn it around and it make this sound. And it was only much later in life I discovered that this was a job killer. The rotary phone was a job killer, was a not so silent job killer, okay? And what you're doing when you dial a rotary phone is each time you put your finger in it and turn it on, you're sending an electrical pulse to the switchboard that sends them, it's like a message that sends it to the switchboard that says, go to this part of the board. And when you dial a complete number, it's actually finding the patch. And so it's one-for-one automating the telephone operator. Right? It's like sending primitive code to a switchboard to make the connection for you. And so AT&T developed this technology and implemented it in a staggered way, city by city, and put telephone operators, millions of them, completely out of work within a decade. Just totally out of work. I mean, just gone. We don't need you anymore. And so you might have thought, well, that really harmed them. It was horrible. Actually, and it did harm people who were incumbent workers because they lost their jobs and they found jobs that maybe weren't quite as remunerative. But if you look at young women, I mean, again, they were mostly young women, high school educated young women, the women in those cities who were looking for jobs, even just a year after these things were automated, they did fine, actually. Like, no worse. They weren't harmed at all. And the reason is because the existence of mechanical switching meant we could call everybody all the time, so there's lots more communication. We really have this human desire for it, so when you make it cheaper, you want more of it, right? And so we created jobs like the secretary, right? These jobs, secretary and lots of other office jobs, filing clerks, financial clerks, accounts receivable, all those things, those jobs were created out of a desire for greater and denser communication between people. Right? And so the real foundational invention was this thing. Okay, anybody used a typewriter recently? Okay, I think I have you beat. I've used a typewriter recently because in Kirkland House, we have these open houses with our students every other week. And for fun, we have an old typewriter that we have people sign in. So when they come in, they type their name on the typewriter to let them know. So it's still very pleasing to type on it. But the typewriter was a really important development because what it allowed people to do is type fast enough to get close enough to recording human speech. And so people can speak about 150 words a minute, but you can only write about 30 words a minute. Shorthand, you can do better than that, but shorthand's really hard to comprehend, right? And so what the typewriter did is say, okay, actually you can type about 100 words a minute, that's close enough, and you can record meetings, and you can record interactions, you can record phone calls. And that created a huge demand for jobs like secretaries and administrative assistants. So what happened? Well, you can see right around the time, so the telephone was telephone mechanical switching, automated telephone work in the around 1920, okay? But that actually coincides with a huge increase in office jobs. So between 1920, 1900 to 1920 and about 1980, you saw a huge rise. This is an employment share going from, let's say for typists, secretaries, and administrative assistants, it went from less than 1% to something like 4% of all jobs in a couple of decades. Right? And if you add these three numbers up in 1980, which was the peak, 12.8%, so more than 1 in 8 of all jobs were devoted to information and communication. Just the act of connecting people and allowing them to communicate. Now you might say, well, what's going on with that decline there at the end? Well, anybody want to guess what happened around 1980 that changed that? The personal computer, very good, right. So why did the personal computer cause office work to start to disappear? We went from information poverty to information overload. Right? So what the computer does is it encodes information in digital form. And digital information has a really important property, which is that it's what economists would call non-rival. What does that mean? It means my consumption of it doesn't interfere with your consumption of it. Right? So when you type something up in a written memo, it's a physical copy and there's one of it. Now maybe you can use carbon paper and make more than one copy, right? But you had to use another resource, the carbon paper, to do it. Right? And so every piece of information that a secretary types up or an office clerk files is in physical form somewhere and is rival. It can only be used at one time and it's in one place. With digital information, it can be everywhere. I can write up a memo, I can write up a presentation, I can send it to 1,000 people, I can send it to 10,000 people. It doesn't matter. And so what that does is because we can modify it and copy it costlessly, it reduces the value of information, creating new information to zero, the cost of creating new information to zero, basically. And so now information's everywhere. All right? This is kind of a fundamental lesson of economics, which is that when you lower the cost of something to zero, you get a lot more of it. Okay. So right now, by some estimates, I don't have any idea how people make these estimates, but let's just say they're accurate. The internet stores about 147 zettabytes of data. What's a zettabyte? Well, 1 zettabyte is about 250 billion DVDs worth of storage. Okay, so that's a big number, a very big number, 147 zettabytes. And that's a very, very recent change. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO, chairman of Google, estimates, again, I don't know how he estimates this, but let's take it as gospel for now, that in all of human history up to 2003, only about 0.05 zettabytes of information had ever been created. So we've gone from a world where people are paying to create information. So what is the job of a secretary or a typist? The job is to create information. And that job has economic value when information is scarce. But information is, not only is information no longer scarce, we actually have the opposite problem, which is that we're drowning in it. And so the economic value, if anything, goes to people who can compress information, can take a huge sea of data and make meaning out of it. And that's the fundamental change that started to happen with digitization. My view is it's not actually about AI, it's about digital information. And AI is just the latest manifestation of that, which is an increasing ability to manipulate, store, retrieve, perform sophisticated statistical operations on data and give you answers. Okay? So what does that mean for us? Well, I think I'm pretty short on time, yes. So let me not, do you guys want to hear about a survey that I did about AI? You can just, okay, all right, fine. All right, so let me tell you so that's really the change. What does it mean? Do we have any evidence that AI is actually changing the labor market? I think so, yes, we do. Let me give you just 2 quick pieces of evidence. One is, this is again from the same paper. If you look at, I want you to look at the bottom line, which is employment and STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics occupations. If you look at the number at 2000 to 2012, those jobs actually shrank slightly as a share of all jobs in the US economy. Starting around 2012, 2013, we saw a huge and extremely rapid rise in STEM employment. So it went from about 6.5% of all jobs to 10% in about a decade. Why is that? Well, this is around the time that big technology companies started making huge investments in information processing, not just data centers, but hiring talent to work on AI models, et cetera. You can see private fixed investment in information processing as a share of GDP is not quite at an all-time high. It was a bit frothier right before the dot-com boom and bust, but it's near an all-time high. And then investment in R&D is actually at an all-time high as a share of GDP right now. And so this isn't quite AI transforming work, but it's saying companies are making such huge investments in AI capacity that you can already see it in the data. Okay, so the composition of jobs has really changed a lot in the last decade because of these investments. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we've seen a huge and very rapid decline in the share of all jobs in retail sales. So it's showing you in two different data sources that around 2010, the employment share, basically one in 14 jobs were in retail sales, 7.5%, and now it's less than 6%. In other words, over a period where the US economy added 19 million jobs, we've lost almost 1 million jobs in retail sales. Okay. Now, this isn't about generative AI. That's generative AI is much too new. But generative AI isn't the only type of AI. There's another type of AI people sometimes call predictive AI, which companies like Amazon have been using for a long time, using data to optimize inventory management. They hired a robotics company called Kiva. They bought a robotics company called Kiva Robotics, which uses computer vision and other technologies to optimize the movement of robots around a factory floor. If you've ever seen a video, it's like these tiny little orange robots that whiz and whir around and find all the products and bring them over. So that's also AI. And there's pretty good evidence that e-commerce and companies that are very AI intensive are eating much more and more into the share of in-person retail, and you can see that in the data. So this is already happening. Last thing I want to show you is a little bit about how AI compares to past technology. So very quickly, we did the survey I mentioned, and we asked people a very simple question: are you using generative AI? And the survey we conducted was very specifically designed to mimic a survey called the Current Population Survey, which is the most widely used source of labor market information in the US. So we copied the exact CPS question structure, and we gave this survey in the same week that the CPS is given to the same set of people. Okay. And that allowed us to see if the data was representative of the US, like the CPS is, and if it isn't, to weight it. So if we had more people who were older, or more people who were online, or more educated, we could just weight the data to be representative of the US population. So what we found is, if you look overall, about 10.9 plus 21.1, 32% of people said that they used generative AI at least once in the last week. Okay. About 25, almost 25%, 24.2% of people said they used it at least once at work, and 1 in 9 used it every day at work. So we asked a bunch of questions about this, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but I want to just call your attention to one thing, which is because we asked these questions and the CPS itself asked questions about technology adoption in the past, we can compare it to other technologies and ask, is the adoption of generative AI faster, slower, or about the same as two other big deal technologies, personal computers and the internet? Okay. And so here's what we found. So part of the art here is dating the adoption of a technology to commercialization. So there's an art form to this. So we chose the beginning of generative AI as the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. For the personal computer, we chose the release of the IBM PC, which was the first PC to sell 1 million copies. That was 1981. And then for the internet, we dated it to 1995, which was the year that Netscape IPO'd, and was also the year that the internet was open to commercial activity. Okay? So what we do is we say, okay, relative to 1995, what share of people were using the internet in 1998, for example, 3 years later? And the same for all of these. And what we found is that basically by that standard, generative AI is being adopted faster than personal computers or the internet. So the red line shows you that computers, this is from the CPS computer use supplement, what they found was that 3 years after, so this is 1984, 3 years after the IBM PC, about 20% of all people said they used a computer. With the internet, 3 years after it was commercialized, 1995, 3 years afterwards, it was about 40% of all people, 30 to 40%. And for generative AI, it's closer to 40%. So of course, we only have one dot. We want to trace this out. We'll be doing this survey over time and seeing how it compares. But the point of this is to say, by some fair comparison where we're asking the same types of questions and dating it the same type of way, it looks like adoption of AI has been very fast. Let me just conclude there. I have a couple other results, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time. If not, yeah, it was fun. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, David. And let's see, Philip? All right. I think
I was going to give you 2 questions.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to.
I think 2 questions for David.
Make them count.
So what AI is trying to solve?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So here's my view, speculative, okay? I think that in the I think it'll take a long time, as I said, it'll take many decades, but I think AI will drive the cost of manipulating information to zero, and we, in the long run, will no longer need office support, routine information processing jobs. So I think that the administrative assistant as an occupation is essentially over. Again, I think it'll take a few decades, but you already see that happening in the data, and I think that trend will continue. I think it's a harder question to answer when it comes to using information to make decisions for a couple of reasons. One is that generative AI models, LLMs, reason very differently than people, so they need tons of data, but they can run operations on much more data than the human mind can. But people are very good at creating good enough models with very small amounts of data. So we're very good guessers. And so there are problems where you face a decision only rarely, there's not a lot of training data for it, and are very unusual, and people are better at that than AI models. So that doesn't, so my view is that actually you're going to have a lot of situations where a person knowing how to use AI is going to beat an AI alone when it comes to decision making. So I don't think AI, at least in the, I'm just forecasting based on current technology, obviously. But from what I see right now, I don't think AI will replace, like, say, managerial decision making. I think it'll complement it very seriously. The other reason is that a lot of interactions, economic interactions, are strategic. So if you're a business leader and you're trying to make a decision about where to locate some new stores or what market to move into, the right decision isn't just some answer that a model can reason from. The right answer depends on what your competitors are going to do. And so if my competitors have a frontier AI model and I have a frontier AI model, the person who makes the right decision might be the human who knows how to use the AI model better. Because again, the answer is not a thing. And it depends on what I think my competitor is going to do. So there's a lot of things like that that I think AI models, at least current incarnations of them, are not equipped to do yet.
Hi, this is a very interesting presentation. So quick question regarding these comparisons of PC and AI.
Yeah.
Because AI is developed on the background of PC, so
Yeah.
this comparison may not be fair because these are if you already experience using something, you can use variety of things. But if you compare with directly, there is no relevant, like absolutely different, then you can say this is the fair comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about, is it a fair comparison, PCs and generative AI? I would say that it's not a fair comparison if your goal is to, in some platonic sense, ask which one is more disruptive, right? Because as you said, you're right, the only way you can use generative AI is because you have a PC. And actually, you can only use it because you have internet, too. So the three technologies have built cumulatively on each other. So, but that's not the question. The question is just making a prediction. Like, is AI going to be everywhere like computers are? And then the fact that it's built on the base of this other technology already is a virtue, right? So the fact that, I think it's right that the reason why 40% of people are using it 2 years after it was released is because they have computers and because they have the internet. But to me, that's a reason to think that's more reason to think it's going to be everywhere. So in other words, if you're trying to answer the academic question of which one's more fundamental in some way, I don't know the answer to that. But the question I'm answering is, how likely is it that AI is going to be everywhere the way PCs are everywhere? Like, I just look at this in a very factual way. Like, if I went back to 1984 and I showed you those data, what would you do differently? Whatever's happening right now, the computer is everywhere now. Everyone in this room has a computer, and they use it all the time, and then you have a mobile device. And so knowing now that generative AI is on that level that computers were 20 plus years ago tells you it's going to be everywhere in 20 years. I mean, in a predictive sense. Thanks a lot.